provided a compelling, if ultimately flawed, justification for the sacrifice of life that Germany had required of its citizens during World War I. In its radical variant, nationalism in this period demanded the sacrifice of groups within the nation in order to achieve what to us seems a dystopia of ethnic homogeneity. During World War II, that dystopia ended in the death spaces implied in the Nazi idea of living space. In plain words, it ended with genocide. German nationalism, in this way of seeing it, was not the dark culmination point of a long and destructive history of Germany. Rather, it was a crucial, ultimately devastating, but also historical chapter in that history. The second argument of the book is about the balance between war and peace in the longue durée of the German past. Shelves of books have been written on the military history of the German nation, yet for long stretches of history, Germans conceived of their country as essentially pacific, and their neighbors have often concurred, sometimes in the form of a complaint. Martial spirit and love of fatherland hardly exist for contemporary Germans, a dismayed Madame de Stael wrote in 1810. But when her brilliant book, De l'Allemagne, finally appeared after the defeat of Napoleon at the Battle of Nations in Leipzig in October 1813, her insight seemed out of step with events, and it is hardly necessary to recount that no small part of Germany's subsequent history occurred in the shadow of militarism, military destruction, and violence. Today we know a very different Germany, one concerned with social stability and economic growth rather than military might and territorial expansion, one that no longer requires its male citizens to serve in the army, and one in which death, to cite the historian Michael Howard, is no longer part of the social contract. Yet peace does not leave us only with blank pages, as Hegel once said of happiness. Rather, in both an absolute and a relative sense, peace has been as important to the long historical arc of the German nation as war. Consider the measure that political scientists use to gauge bellicosity, the so-called conflict catalogue. It charts major and minor conflicts of the last half-millennium and estimates their lethality and duration. If one takes 1,000 deaths as the threshold for war, filtering out smaller skirmishes, the German lands experienced roughly twice as many years of peace as of war between 1500 and 1914. Overall lethality, even when calculated against estimated population levels, remained low for decades in certain periods, like the 80 years after the Peasants' War of 1525, the late 18th century, after the 7 Years' War, and for almost 100 years after the conclusion of the Congress of Vienna in 1815. Skeptics will no doubt point out that Prussia, a martial state, unified Germany in 1871, and this fact inevitably skews the whole history. Yet this approach commits the error of the small Prussian school, which narrowed German history into an appendage of Prussian history, and forgot that for many decades Prussia, as has been shown recently, was a weaker and less bellicose power than is often imagined. The message of the conflict catalogue comes still more forcefully to the fore when Germany is considered in comparison with other European nations. It reveals, for example, that in the 18th and 19th centuries, Great Britain and France were the great martial powers, that in Central Europe, Austria was a more menacing military might than Prussia, and that the German lands, often thought to be in a vulnerable central position, actually enjoyed more years of peace than many of the neighboring countries. The third argument of the book is about realism and tragedy. It is perhaps the most abstract of the three arguments, but it nevertheless might open a conceptual door to new ways of thinking about nations. It derives from a line of inquiry pursued by Erich Auerbach, a German Jewish literary scholar, who between 1942 and 1945 wrote a remarkable work, Mimesis, the representation of reality in Western literature, while in exile in Istanbul. In Mimesis, Auerbach argued that social realistic ways of seeing are achieved when the